So I'm going to start. All right, so the mnemonic for all the spinal tracts, it's a pretty lengthy mnemonic, so there's a story that goes with it so that it makes a little bit more sense. What we're going to be doing is the drawing that's on page 68 in the textbook. It's a cross-section of the spinal cord. We're going to be working through that in a clockwise direction, starting at 12 o'clock, going back to 12 o'clock. So we'll start with the mnemonic. I'll introduce that. Then we'll break it out, see how, and we'll draw the whole thing out. The reason that that's useful is that on our exam, and I think the trimester after us, he literally took that picture from the textbook and said, okay, this is A. What is A? Not what is A, but like which one of these tracts is associated with pain and temperature sensation. So knowing it from the diagram can be super helpful for the exam. So the mnemonic starts with a village in Africa. Okay, so you're in Africa. There's the African village. This village in Africa has a problem with lions. The problem that they have with lions is that the lions are eating men. Okay? It's a lion eating a man. All right? Now, with all the men getting eaten by lions, there's a lot of children left around, and you have good children, and then you have bad children. And the bad children are plotting revenge, and the good children are not. Okay? So here's the mnemonic. Again, it's long, but that's the backstory. Good children don't plot. After lions ate all the men left. Vengeance ruins lions' fun. So, good children don't plot. After lions ate all the men left, vengeance ruins lions' fun. So we'll start with the drawing of that cross-section of the cord. We're going to put the gray matter in there. Okay, and as promised, we're going to start at 12 o'clock, go in a clockwise direction, which is the same way same order that he presented it in class. So, right here, we have gracillus. Gracillus meaning slender. And then we have cuneatus right next to it. So good children don't. Don't is dorsolateral tract. So dorsolateral tract, that's on that page. The very last one where he's talking about tracts. It contains medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts, dorsolateral tract, and fasciculus proprius. You don't have to know which way those guys run or anything, but pay attention to the words on that page. I know last trimester the verbiage he used was the one collateral something. That would have tripped me up because that was a very specific word that I had never associated with the dorsolateral tract. So on that page specifically, pay really close attention to the words. And I'm only on some of these while I talk about the functions during this part. Most of them I'll talk about in a second. But the dorsolateral tract, that's pain information. It comes in, it goes up a tract or down a tract. Synapses in the second rexid lamina. That's really all there is to that. So, good children don't plot. So we're going to draw a crooked exclamation mark. Good children don't plot after. Now these two tracts are named for their relation to each other. Posterior tract is behind the anterior tract. And we're talking about ascending tract fibers here, so they're going to start with spinal. And we have spinocerebellar and spinothalamic. The way I remember which one comes first in this is C comes before T. So this is spinocerebellar. Posterior spinocerebellar and anterior spinocerebellar. The next two are found at this bottom tip. Good children don't plot after lions. 8. And these are going to be your spinothalamic tracts. Good children don't plot after lions. 8. All the. So right on the other side of this fissure, the one at the bottom is the A, and the one at the top is the T. It's a little tricky, but if you draw your T like this, the one that the T touches, that's the T1. It's going to be your tectospinal tract. And the A is the anterior corticospinal tract. And now we've crossed into the realm of the descending tract fibers. So the next 3 tracts, if you look in the book, they're just little dots down at the bottom. I was having the hardest time keeping them straight until I stopped thinking about them like dots. And I started thinking about them like little sheep. Okay? So good children don't plot after lions ate all the men left vengeance. So this sheep over here looked kind of lonely to me. It was all off by itself. I named her Mary. And then this one, this sheep didn't look very lonely at all. If you guys can see what's going on there between those 2 other sheep. That way I don't have to explain it because I get all flustered. Okay? This one's extra lonely because that's her husband, the sheep that's on top. All right? It's Mary and Larry. Mary and Larry are medial and lateral. Sometimes when you get married, you end up with a ridiculous last name. They have a ridiculous last name. In fact, it's reticulous. It's the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts. And though they have clearly an unhappy marriage, they have a nice tidy home. The reticulospinal tracts are the housekeeping tracts. They deal with blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, things like that that just keep your body running the way it should. I call it housekeeping. They have an unhappy marriage but a tidy home. Those are your reticulospinal tracts. Next we come to V, the vixen. That's your vestibulospinal tract because she fell down, vestibulospinal. When she fell down, her legs became uncrossed and they went all the way down. The vestibulospinal tract is an uncrossed tract. Okay? It does not cross at all. It stays on ipsilateral side. So this one is uncrossed and it goes all the way down. We'll get into more specifics in a second about which tracts stop where. So, back to the mnemonic. Good children don't plot after lions ate all the men left. Vengeance ruins lions' fun. So, I'm going to draw a heart, because that's what I think it looks like in the book. And right under the heart, we have a circle. So sometimes if you love somebody enough, you might give them a precious jewel or a gem or something like that. And one of those gems you might give them is a ruby. This is the rubrospinal tract. Now the rubrospinal tract, the easier way to remember what it does is if you give a precious gem to Golem from the Lord of the Rings, he's going to grab it, right? And he's going to call it his precious. My precious! He's going to flex, right? He's not going to be like, my precious, my precious. Flexes everything. Cerebrospinal tract is for flexor musculature. Vengeance ruins lions. So if I take this heart and I aim the bottom of it a little better, I draw it out like Cupid's arrow, it points to its partner. So this was the anterior corticospinal tract. This is the lateral corticospinal tract. And you can get, just from the drawing, a piece of information that Dr. Torgood likes to test on. This is 5 to 15% of the tract fibers, and this is 95 to 85% of the tract fibers. Basically, there's just significantly more fibers in the lateral corticospinal tract than there are in the anterior corticospinal tract. And the last tract we talk about is fun. So different people do different things for fun. Some people play tennis, some people go shopping at the mall, other people might race cars. If you're going to race cars, it's best to have a fast car. If you want a fast car, I would not recommend the Toyota Prius. So if you want to go fast, don't buy a Prius. This is the fasciculus proprius. The word was hard for me to remember. I had to come up with a story. There it is. This is another one of those tracts on that page with the dorsolateral tract and the reticulospinal tract. You don't need to know the pathway, but the questions he likes to ask are, it's the first one to develop embryologically. It also has to do with spinal reflexes. So that's the first part. Is everyone good with what's on the board currently? Anyone need to copy stuff down still? Okay, I'm going to erase it real quick. And we're going to do the next part. So for the next part, I'm going to be drawing 7 brains, spinal cords, cerebellums, and thalamuses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. As we go across, just real simple, not super fancy. Brain, thalamus, cerebellum, and spinal cord. I just do them all the same because it's easier to do things all the same. Give you guys a second if you need it. So we're going to go roughly through this the same way we went through it before. So same mnemonics, same process, same order. We're going to start right with this first spine, brain, thalamus. We're going to do gracilis and cuneatus. So we'll do gracilis on this side, cuneatus on this side. To start, I go right to the bottom and I draw a boot. Okay? That boot is to remember that the gracilis tract goes all the way down to your foot. All right? It goes from your foot, enters the spinal cord, travels up on the ipsilateral side of the cord. That tract synapses in the medulla oblongata on a nucleus that shares the name of the tract, so the nucleus gracilis. From there, that information is going to cross on arcuate fibers It's going to travel in the medial lemniscus, and synapse in the thalamus. And then the third order neuron is going to go from the thalamus to the cortex. On the cuneatus side, I draw a hand. That helps me remember that the cuneatus tract does not exist below the T5, T6 level. So that information's basically the same thing as gracilis. It's going to enter the cord, travel up the ipsilateral side, synapse in the medulla oblongata, on a nucleus that shares the name of the tract, the nucleus cuneatus. Again, crossing on arcuate fibers, medial lemniscus, and then tertiary neuron to the cortex. Now these tracts are responsible for 3 types of information: kinesthetic, proprioception, 2-point touch, and vibration. Any questions on this first one?
It's a medulla oblongata, right?
Both of them are medulla oblongata, yep. Okay, so good children don't. That was dorsolateral. We're not going to talk about that. Plot after. That's going to be your posterior spinocerebellar and your anterior spinocerebellar. On this side of the cord, where I'm talking about the posterior spinocerebellar, I draw a boot again. Because I have a boot that reminds me to draw these dots. Now the boot represents gracilis tract, because below the cord level of L2 or L3, I don't remember exactly which one, there is no posterior spinocerebellar tract. That information piggybacks on gracilis. Okay, so it rides gracilis up to L2, L3, then it synapses on the spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar tract, on a nucleus, Clark's nucleus, or the nucleus dorsalis. That's what all these dots are. And they run from C8 to L2. L3, okay. L3. So that information enters the cord at L3, synapses on the tracts, on the nucleus dorsalis, runs up on the ipsilateral side of the cord, and goes through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So it comes in down low. You guys will learn, if you're going to clubs now, when we talk about pelvic listings, things go PI, posterior and inferior. That's how I remember it. The posterior goes through the inferior. The anterior one goes through the superior. So if you've gone to any clubs, they've talked about it at all. Pelvises go PI or AS. An easy way to remember that. Okay. On the anterior spinocerebellar side, I draw a high heel. And that reminds me that the anterior spinocerebellar tract is the naughty one. So any information from the cerebellum is ipsilateral. The right side of the cerebellum talks to the right side of the body, left side to the left side. Very clear on this posterior spinocerebellar. Came in on this side, stayed on that side the entire time, and then went into the cerebellum on the same side. Cool. Well, this one's naughty. It enters the cord, then the information crosses to the contralateral side, and then crosses back to go through the superior cerebellar peduncle. And just for consistency, because we had a hand on the last one, I'm going to put a hand on this one too, on the same side. But that's to remind you to look at the cuneocerebellar tract. There's a paragraph in that section on this page. These two tracts carry information from the lower extremity. Cuneocerebellar is upper extremity. Okay. Now, what type of information? The cues I use to get me to that answer are the first letters, posterior and anterior. Okay, forward and backwards, right? If I'm walking forwards, I can move in large, gross movements. I don't have to really think about it. The anterior spinocerebellar tract is for gross movement proprioception. Okay. Now, if I'm walking backwards in contrast, I need to be a little bit more careful so I don't trip and fall. We're going to call that fine motor proprioception. Does that make sense? So, in summary, posterior spinocerebellar tract, fine motor proprioception to the lower extremity, anterior spinocerebellar tract, gross motor proprioception to the lower extremity, cuneocerebellar tract, motor proprioception to the upper extremity. Okay? Any questions about that one?
The hand also crosses over.
Nope. No. Hand does not cross over. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the cuneocerebellar tract actually doesn't exist as an individual tract in the spinal cord. It piggybacks on cuneatus and then goes from there to the cerebellum, something like that. You'll have to check the notes. Okay, so good children don't plot after lines 8. Lines 8 is lateral spinal thalamic and anterior spinal thalamic. Whereas the spinocerebellar tracts ended up in the cerebellum, the spinal thalamic tracts are going to end up in the thalamus. And to talk about the function of these two, again, I use the first word as my cue. So lateral meaning side, anterior meaning front, and I use my face as the example. So lateral, if I get slapped in the side of my face, it's going to hurt and it's going to burn. The lateral spinal thalamic tract is pain and temperature. If I get slapped in the side of the face, I'm going to want to know about that immediately. So when the information comes in, synapses, and then it crosses immediately before ascending on the contralateral side. And then the tertiary neuron, again, is going to go from the thalamus to the cortex. Okay, so anterior spinal thalamic tract, talking about the front of my face. I'm not going to slap myself in the front of the face. I'm going to touch it lightly. And if I'm lying in bed in the morning and my wife was to do this to me, I'd be like, no, I don't really have to wake up right now. I don't need to know about this immediately. I could wake up gradually, right? So as information enters the cord for the anterior spinal thalamic tract, which is for light touch, that information is going to cross gradually and then ascend on the contralateral side, going up to the thalamus, and then tertiary to the cortex. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So those are your ascending tracts. We're going to switch into descending tracts. Right at the beginning, I want to talk about pyramidal and extrapyramidal tract fibers. So the way I remember what these specific functions are, so the first dotted line is because we're transitioning into descending tracts. The second dotted line is from pyramidal to extrapyramidal. So I draw my pyramid in here. And with the pyramid, I draw my pharaoh. So the pharaoh wakes up one morning and he's like, I had a great dream last night. I'm inspired. I have this idea. I want my people to build a statue for me. I want it to be a 70-foot tall cat statue, and I would like my face on it. He's initiated a process, okay? He woke up in the morning and he initiated. Your pyramidal tract fibers initiate voluntary skilled movement of distal extremities. That little phrase right there, that's straight from his text and he loves it. Initiates voluntary skilled movement of distal extremities. So the pharaohs initiated this idea. The word goes out. That this is what he wants. But the person who has to build it, really, is this guy. He's probably going to have a whip. He's the labor foreman, okay? So he's basically getting the word from the pharaoh that he wants a statue. The foreman has to influence how it actually gets done. So the pharaoh initiated the idea. The foreman in the field influences the decision. There's a U in there. So the way this works is the pharaoh tells my arm to grab the marker. It didn't work so well. The pharaoh tells my arm to grab my marker, but then the foreman's like, grab it nicely, not like an idiot. Oh, much more successful, okay? So initiating voluntary skilled movement and then influencing it. So our pyramidal tract fibers, that's going to be your anterior and your lateral corticospinal tracts. Anterior corticospinal and lateral corticospinal. Anterior corticospinal is the first one, it's the smallest one, and it's the most boring one. So information starts in the cortex on the contralateral side, comes down, and then it crosses when it gets to where it's going. Okay? Pretty boring, right? So if I ask you, is this tract interesting? You're going to say, no. You're going to say no with a big head shake because the only thing this tract really does is axial movement of the head and neck. and it's going to end mid-thoracic level. The lateral corticospinal tract. So again, we're going to start on the contralateral side. Information is going to come down. It's going to cross in the pyramids. Those structures you would have seen in lab on the anterior surface of the brainstem, those two bumps. The lateral corticospinal tract crosses in the pyramids. And then it would synapse in brexit lamina 9 or brexit lamina 7, depending on where it was going. And again, the words he loves for the lateral corticospinal tract, your pyramidal tract fibers, is initiating, voluntary, skilled movement of distal extremities. So that's our pyramidal tract fibers. Moving into extrapyramidal tract fibers, we're going to have tectospinal tract. We're going to have the rubrospinal tract. And we're going to have the vestibulospinal tract. Now, tectospinal tract, I didn't write tecto, I only wrote tect, T-E-C-T. That's because this tract ends at C4. There's 4 letters, N-T-E-C-T. This information begins in the superior colliculus of the midbrain's tegmentum. And it's going to cross as it descends in no specific area, but then it terminates at C4. The tract does not exist below C4. When I talk about the function of this tract, I think, okay, techno music is at raves. I'm at a rave. What am I doing at a rave? I do not belong here. There's bright lights. There's loud music. Okay? The bright lights are going to flash over here. The loud music's going to blast from over here, and all of a sudden it's like flash, and then boom, and then flash. I'm whipping my head back and forth, right? The tectospinal tract has to do with auditory and visual reflexes rotating the head and neck. He showed you guys a video of the football guy in the end zone and that ball to the face. Tectospinal tract. Okay, rubrospinal tract begins at the nucleus rubor. Again in the midbrain. It's also called the red nucleus. Using a red marker, see what I did there? That information is going to cross as it descends in the midbrain. We've already touched on its function a little bit, so it's going to deal with flexor musculature, right, my precious? So it's going to influence flexor musculature, and in order to do that, it's going to inhibit extensor musculature. It's an important point. I can't close my hand if the extensors are firing at the same time. So I would just write that as influencing flexor and inhibiting extensor. And that one's going to go all the way down. Just like the vixen, the vestibulospinal tract, that's going to start at Dieter's nucleus. The vestibular nucleus located in the medulla oblongata. One trimester between Dan Haig's trimester and now, there was a question on the exam, which descending tract is the only one that has a nucleus of origin in the medulla oblongata. There it is, your vestibulospinal tract. So we know that this one is uncrossed and also goes all the way down. And whereas the cerebrospinal tract dealt with flexors, the vestibulospinal tract deals with extensors. I remember that by, it's winter right now, perfect time to talk about this. You're walking to class, there's an icy patch, you step on it, you go to fall. Yard sale, right? You throw everything you can, extend every muscle in your body to try to catch yourself. Vestibulospinal tract is influencing extensor musculature and inhibiting flexors. That's all of it. Are there any questions about tracts? Okay. Everyone good with what's on the board? Anyone need a second to write anything down? Okay. Next we're going to do the drawings that are on page 93. 93, 94, and 98. You can expect to see an apparent origin question. You can expect to see a nucleus of origin or nucleus of termination question. That's what these drawings are for, to help you keep straight where things are as they come in and come out of where they begin. I call them Harry the Frog prints for the one on 93 and the ones on 94 and 98. Those are the two boob drawings because the cerebellar connections look like boobs to me. So that's what those are. So Harry the Frog prints, we're going to be talking about all the apparent origins of the cranial nerves on the anterior surface of the midbrain. So we start with the frog prince's crown. Is that dark enough? Can you guys all see that? And get that one. It was green though. It was going to be a frog in green. It was going to be so good. All right. So we start with this crown. That's the top of the crown, and then the things that hold the crown off the head, and a couple of fancy jewels. So the crown, that's the optic tract, cranial nerve 2. The optic chiasm right there. The things holding the crown up off of his head, those are the crus cerebri. Those aren't going to be, he won't test you about that on the drawing, but it's for perspective. The two gems in the middle, mammillary bodies. They deal with short-term memory. Again, you'll get that later on. Okay, so now we're going to draw the frog's head. And his two eyes. He's a frog prince, so he's going to be well dressed, so we're going to kind of put him in a tuxedo standing like this. I don't like that. We're not going to do that. We're going to do this. Okay, so the frog's head, that's the pons, right? Viewed from the anterior surface. This is the medulla oblongata right in here. His arm, that's spinal nerve C1. It's where the medulla oblongata ends. Now we're going to start naming our cranial nerves and putting them in. He's Harry the Frog Prince. It's because he's hairy, not because he's British or anything like that. So we're going to put some hairs sticking out from around his crown, right here. These two most medial ones, those are going to be cranial nerve 3. What's nice about how they named these, or numbered them for us, is that they kind of went medial to lateral, top to bottom. So the next one lateral to that. That's cranial nerve 4. For the next exam, you'll have to know 4 important facts about cranial nerve 4, but not for this one. His eyeballs are cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. So it would be said that the cranial nerve 5's apparent origin is on the lateral surface of the pons. So we went 3, 4, 5. We're going to go back medial down here. He's got a hair sticking out of his shirt. It's cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve. He's got a wild hair coming out over here. That's cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and then cranial nerve 8 sticks out this way. So he's a pretty dapper frog prince. He's got some hair issues, not the biggest thing in the world. He's got his tux on. When you're wearing a tux, you're probably going to stick a flower in it, right? So right here, that's a flower for our purposes. That's cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. Controls the tongue muscles. He's a frog, he's got a tongue. Makes sense that the anterior surface would have the cranial nerve for the tongue. These middle two lines, those are going to be your pyramids, where those lateral corticospinal tracts cross as they descend. And then just lateral to that, these two bumps are going to be your olives. And that's Harry the Frog Prince. So all the cranial nerve apparent origins that come off the anterior surface. There's some good trends, okay? Medial to lateral and then top to bottom. The only one that's kind of an oddball is this cranial nerve 12. That's the flower in his lapel. You can remember this cranial nerve 12. Tongue muscles, it's a frog. Frogs have tongues. Yeah?
If there was a fly, he could be using his tongue to get it.
Yeah, totally. If there was a fly, he'd be using his tongue to get it. Everyone good with this drawing? Be okay if I erase it? Okay. posterior surface, okay? If you go to the drawing on page 94, we're going to be looking at the posterior surface of the brainstem. What we're seeing in this drawing, these two large, they would be balls up here. Those are the thalamic bodies, the thalamic nuclei. In the middle, we've got the pineal gland. Again, not testable on this exam, just there for reference. And then from here, we have the cerebral peduncles right here. So the pons would be anterior to that. And then we have the medulla oblongata down here. On this posterior surface, I imagine this like, this is obviously a bikini top. If she had some weird like bandana sticking out of her bikini top, come down like this to a point. This is the rhomboid fossa in here. At the bottom of the rhomboid fossa, we have the central canal, opening to the central canal of the spinal cord. And just anterior to that is the obex, or the vomit control center. That's another small detail that he likes to throw in here. It's spelled O-B-E-X. Okay, so cranial nerves. Here we have our woman. We're going to give her a collarbone. If you remember at the top of Harry the Frog Prince's head, cranial nerve 4 kind of came around from the side. This is cranial nerve 4. And that's what it does. The nucleus is actually over here. It crosses as it exits, and then wraps around to go control an eye muscle. Okay? We knew 5, 6, 7, and 8. Those were all on the anterior surface. We can see 7 and 8, though, from down here. And then, right from down here, okay, you're going to have cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. That'll make sense on the next drawing. They all come from the nucleus ambiguus. And they're going to be coming out from right there. So it would be like the lateral posterior aspect of the medulla oblongata houses the apparent origins for which cranial nerves. That's your answer there. He's usually not too bad on these, but those dorsal median sulcus, the dorsal lateral sulcus, and the dorsal intermediate sulcus, those might show up, but he's not too bad. Basically, they're just going to be coming down like that. The dorsal median sulcus is the one right here. That's what was in between the two tracts gracilis on the back side, which means that these two bumps, this is going to be tract gracilis and that's going to be tract cunatus. So it's kind of nice you actually know what those two features are. And then you have the dorsal intermediate sulcus and the dorsal lateral sulcus. And that's it for the posterior surface. Be good with that. Any questions? Can I erase it? Water. Okay, next is the drawing on page 98. It's the 16 nuclei of origin and termination. He will absolutely have a question about one of those on the exam for sure. You guys should have gone over which cranial nerves are motor and sensory and mixed at this point, at least touched on it at something, yeah? So that's what's going to guide you to, is it a nucleus of origin or a nucleus of termination? If it's sensory, it's a nucleus of termination. If it's motor, it's a nucleus of origin. It's all kinds of stuff that it's both. So we're going to basically set up the drawing the same way. Here's our thalamic bodies. There's the pineal gland. Now remember, on all of this, I'm only drawing one of them, but all of these are going to be bilateral structures. So she doesn't have just one collarbone, she has two. I'm just not going to draw two. At this most superior part, right under these thalamic bodies, we're going to kind of draw these step things. It's going to be your superior and inferior colliculus. So like that tectospinal tract started from the superior colliculus of the midbrain's tegmentum. It's going to be coming from up in there. But again, we're going to follow a similar trend that we did with the anterior surface origins, starting top down, numbering them from there. So cranial nerve 3 is the first one we're going to come to. These 5 dots over here, they represent the true cranial nerve 3. I believe you guys haven't been exposed to this yet, but there's a kind of a math equation that'll help you remember all the extraocular eye muscles. It's LR6SO4 over 3. So LR6SO4 over 3. Basically, the lateral rectus muscle is from the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6. The superior oblique muscle is from the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4. The remaining 3 extraocular eye muscles, the medial rectus, superior rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique, those are all cranial nerve 3. You will need to know those, not for this exam, although actually that might be how he describes what the nuclei of origin do. So it's not going to be the worst thing to learn now. The reason it's 5 dots is because we had 4 extraocular eye muscles. So superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and inferior oblique. The 5th one is the superior palpebra, levator palpebra superioris. That is in his notes. The thing that lifts your eyelid up. All those muscles are going to be from cranial nerve 3. And each muscle has its own nucleus of origin. They all travel in the oculomotor nerve. This dot on the other side, that's 3A, the accessory ocular motor nerve of Edinger, Westphal. That's going to be parasympathetic innervation to the eye. So things like your constrictor pupillae muscle, when you react to light, that kind of stuff comes from there. You guys learned the word periaqueductal gray? Okay. So there's cranial nerve 3. We're going to go to this side. Cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerves 3 and 4, I believe the nuclei are found in the periaqueductal gray matter, which is another good question for him to ask, because that would be on this exam. So that's the trochlear nerve, again associated with the superior oblique muscle, as that equation tells you. Jumping back to the other side, just for clarity, there's a nucleus in the mesencephalon called the mesencephalic trigeminal nuclei. It's called the trigeminal nerve because it has three origins: mesencephalic trigeminal, motor trigeminal, and spinal trigeminal. Those are all going to be on here. So now we're down in the mesencephalon. We're going to come down to the area of the pons. And under the bra, we're going to have three moles. Nice and midline. We're going to call them motor 5. Cranial nerve 6, the abducens. And cranial nerve 7. Motor trigeminal, that's going to be all your muscles of mastication, chewing. You'll learn them later: medial lateral temporalis, masseter. On the opposite side, I'm going to draw two moles over here. Those are your superior and inferior salivatory nuclei. Take a wild guess what those things do. They help you salivate. The superior salivatory nuclei is going to be associated with cranial nerve 7. And the inferior salivatory nuclei is going to be associated with cranial nerve 9. Okay, now we're going to give her a tattoo. Kind of looks like a watch. And that's the third trigeminal nuclei, the spinal trigeminal. But this nucleus isn't only associated with the trigeminal nerve, it also receives input from the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. So it's actually 5, 7, 9, and 10. Okay, we're going to come medial to that. We're going to draw this kind of chair-shaped figure. Looks a little bit like that in the book, but it's a lot longer. I make it into a chair because if I think about time out as a kid, I was told to go sit in the corner, face the wall. I was basically in solitary confinement, right? This is the nucleus solitarius. This has to do with taste. And I draw a little prison underneath it with an upper cell block and a lower cell block because there's two different nuclei with the nucleus solitarius, an upper one and a lower one. The upper one is associated with cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 9. And the bottom one is cranial nerve 9 and cranial nerve 10. You'll learn in Gross 2 next trimester that taste from the front of the tongue, like most of the tongue, is going to be 7 in the front, 9 in the back. Then as you go down your throat, you have taste from 9 and then 10. So it's upper is the tongue and lower is the throat. Again, that's for next trimester, but I think it's helpful now. Sitting in the chair, we have this other nuclei. I'll sometimes just put an 8 there instead. It's cranial nerve 8. There's two nuclei associated with it. Vestibular and cochlear. So balance and hearing. Jumping over to the other side, because it's less cluttered, we're going to do 3 stripes. I always write right on the side, ambiguous over here. Something that is ambiguous is unclear. The ambiguous nucleus of origin is for 3 different cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11. If you guys remember from the last drawing, those 3 hairs that came out just about in that location. The next one medial to that, that's the nucleus of origin for cranial nerve 12. The hypoglossal nerve, think the flower on the front of the frog's lapel. That's going to come from there and project anteriorly. And then the most medial, that's called the dorsal vagus. I'm just going to put dorsal 10. It's going to be a lot of parasympathetic information that the vagus nerve carries to your organs, stuff like that. Then we've got one more long one, and that's your spinal accessory nerve. It's going to go down to about the C4, C5 chord level. And that's going to be your sternocleidomastoid, your trapezius, those major muscles in the head and neck. That's all of them. That's all 16. That's everything that's on page 98 and 99. A lot of the actual information that's there, if you were listening, I covered a pretty hearty portion of that. Any questions on this? Okay. Does anyone need to write any more of it down? I'm going to erase it. Okay, so I just have one more thing. It's for the cerebellum. It's again pretty inclusive. The way I formatted it is I took the drawing that's on page 114 that you guys should have gone through in class and talked about. I took that drawing, I added a whole lot more information to it, and I kind of organized it so that when I talked about it, things went in a nice easy progression, almost in a linear fashion. So if you look at the drawing on page 114, he's got the spinal cord, the brainstem over here. The cerebellum going out that way. And he's got a number of structures listed from here. So of course, I have a mnemonic for that because I can't remember anything without one, apparently. This mnemonic is about date night on the couch and how that progresses. It gets a little racy. So we start with cuddling. We move to touching. And then there's rubbing. And there's a little more rubbing. Then poking, vibrate, intense, and cuddling. So cuddle, touch, rub, rub, poke, vibrate, intense, cuddle. If that's too racy for you, I came up with a lamer one. Come try Red Robin People Very Inexpensive Cuisine. I think that one's wicked stupid. But as we write these out, this is going to be cortex, thalamus, red nucleus, reticular formation, pontine nuclei, vestibular nuclei, inferior olivary nuclei, and this is the cord. Yes?
Can you go to the
The dirty one or the clean one?
dirty one?
Perfect. Cuddle, touch, rub, rub, poke, vibrate, intense, cuddle. Okay, I'm going to work my way this way. So next we get to the cerebellar peduncles, superior, middle, and inferior. He's got a chart on one of the pages in there that talks about the majority of the fibers found in the superior cerebellar peduncle are this, but some are this. I like things visually, so the way I visually do this is I go A, E, A, E, and then I circle the middle. Everything in that circle is the majority. Okay? So the majority of the fibers in the superior cerebellar peduncle are efferent, meaning they're going out of the cerebellum. All of the fibers in the middle are afferent. The majority of the fibers in the inferior are afferent, though there are some efferent. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, working that way, we get to the next part. Don't eat greasy foods. These are your deep cerebellar nuclei. We have dentate, emboliform, globose, and fastigial. And this is a list from largest to smallest, most superficial to most deep.
The third one?
Globose. The emboliform and globose nuclei are called, they're interposed. Okay, and then the last column, it's just 3 letters, C, S, and V. We're talking about the functional lobes of the cerebellum. I put them in this order for 2 reasons. One, because it makes flow pretty nice as I draw it out. And the second, because it's kind of like a hierarchy of evolution. So this is the cerebellum, this is the spinal cerebellum, and this is the vestibulocerebellum. So for vestibulocerebellum, I think of something that's at the lower end of the evolutionary spectrum. We're going to talk about an amoeba, right? Simple, one cell organism, still pretty much knows up from down though, right? It could swim up, it could swim down. It knows its position and it knows about balance. Vestibulocerebellum is for position and balance. For the spinocerebellum, I look at a slightly more complex animal, like a squirrel. A squirrel is going to be a little bit more concerned about its trunk and extremity musculature, because it actually has to use them to climb things. The spinocerebellum is trunk and extremity musculature. And then the cerebrocerebellum, that's our domain. So if I'm going to change that light bulb, I am going to have to plan this out. I'm going to have to climb on a chair, on a table. I'll probably jump. I'll probably hurt myself, but that's still motor planning. The cerebrocerebellum deals with motor planning. Okay. So we're going to talk about afferent information going in and efferent coming out. We're going to talk about efferent going out first. Information from the cerebrocerebellum is going to go through the dentate, deep cerebellum nuclei. It's going to be efferent to the superior cerebellar peduncle, to the thalamus, and then that information goes up to the cortex. So see how that's a nice line?
The dentate synapse.
Yeah. It'll synapse onto the dentate. These fibers here, those are your Purkinjes, which we'll talk about again in a little bit. Okay, information from the spinocerebellum is going to go to all three of these. When it goes to the emboliform or the globose, that information is going to leave through the superior cerebellar peduncle. It's going to go largely to the thalamus, but it's going to send some information to the red nuclei and then to the cortex. Any information that leaves the spinocerebellum and goes to the fastigial deep cerebellar nuclei. It's going to be vestibular information. It's going to go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the vestibular nucleus. And then the vestibulocerebellum bypasses all of that. Inferior cerebellar peduncle to the vestibular nucleus. That's why a lot of balance stuff is said to be subconscious, because the information will come up, go to the vestibulocerebellum, and go right back to the vestibular nucleus to influence those extensor muscles, and you catch your balance. Your body is aware of it almost after the fact. Okay, so while we're right here, I'm going to put a second layer on this. When we talk about the cortex of the cerebellum, we talk about a molecular layer and a granular layer. We talk about granular cells being in the granular layer and molecular cells being, or whatever they talk about in the molecular layer. Okay. So information that synapses in the molecular layer is sent to the granular layer. The granular layer is then sent to Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers make up, that is a tree, for the record. They make up your arbor vitae, tree of life. And then those will synapse on your deep cerebellar nuclei and exit. Is that clear?
What did you say the
Outer layer is molecular layer. Inner layer is the granular layer. I'm going to cheat and look at the book. Hope you don't mind. Perfect, he doesn't say. Okay. So that becomes important when we talk about information coming back in. So is everyone good with information going out? Everything that's drawn up here?
What was the difference between blue and red?
Nothing right now. Blue was vestibular information, actually, if you want to do that. This next time it's going to matter. I'm going to use blue and green. So I'm going to erase all these lines so it doesn't get too confusing. Okay, so I always use blue and green for this part because we have two different types of fibers that come into the cerebellum. We have mossy, which is going to be green because moss is green, and that's nice. Green starts with the letter G, so the mossy fibers are going to go to the granular layer. Mossy, green, granular, glutamate. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter. It's excitatory. It's the most common neurotransmitter in the brain. If you're lying down on moss or grass, it's going to be spiky. These are your spined or spiky fibers. Or maybe these synapses on the spined fibers. Check that. Synapse with spined dendritic branches. Okay, I'm going to use blue for climbing fibers, because when I go climbing up a mountain, getting closer to the sky. When I climb, I go all the way to the top, so all the way up to the molecular layer. For the rest of the information of this, I use the movie 300. Okay, so we've got a bunch of Spartans, and they're going to invade a city in this version of 300. Okay, in order to invade the city, they're going to climb up the walls using ladders. To do it quietly, they're going to go all smooth-like over the top. These are going to synapse on smooth Purkinje fibers. So they're going to climb up over the top of the wall. Synapse on the smooth fibers. And then we're talking about 300, so they're Spartans. This is aspartate. And just like the movie 300, aspartate is extremely excitatory. Okay, so starting with the green marker, starting at the bottom of the list. Okay, so from the spinal cord, we know that we have posterior spinocerebellar tract and anterior spinocerebellar tract. Those are going to be mossy fibers. Posterior spinocerebellar tract goes through the inferior peduncle. We know because they're mossy, they're going to synapse on the granular layer, release glutamate onto spiky Purkinje fibers.
Where did that one originate?
Posterior spinocerebellar tract. So, spinal cord. And since we talked about the neurotransmitter for the other two, I'm just going to throw this in now. Purkinje, that's GABA, and that's inhibitory. Sorry to jump around on you like that. Okay, so this was posterior spinocerebellar. Anterior spinocerebellar, it's going to go through the superior cerebellar peduncle. So again, posterior inferior, anterior superior. Inferior olivary nucleus, Think about the olive tree, or an olive. You think about Italy. You think about the movie 300 and Spartans, which is great because that brings us to climbing fibers. Inferior olivary nucleus is an origination point for climbing fibers. We're going to go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Because we know it's a climbing fiber, we know it's going to synapse on the molecular layer. It's going to release aspartate on the Purkinje fibers, which then influence the deep cerebellar nuclei. Okay, he will have talked to you in class, in the vestibular nuclei. Those are going to be nearly positive those are mossy fibers, but I can't find it right now. But anyway, whatever type of fibers it is, that information is going to go through the middle and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's kind of why it's up here, so it can go through both. The next pathway in, we're going to be talking about corticopontocerebellar information. You will have mentioned that in class. So information comes from the cortex to the pontine nuclei. The pontine nuclei has both climbing and mossy fibers. They're going to go through the middle cerebellar peduncle. Synapse in all those places. That's it. That's everything for exam 2. Don't even bother studying. You're going to be fine. Just kidding. Don't do that. Does anyone have any questions?
What was the last thing that you said?
Pontine cerebellar nuclei has both climbing and mossy fibers. Information from the cortex.